You walk into a sari store and buy a single sachet of shampoo for 7 pesos. Down the street, someone with a car pulls into a supermarket and buys a full bottle for 200. Ounce for ounce, you just paid almost triple what they did. You didn't choose to pay more. You simply didn't have 200 pesos sitting in your pocket today. So why does being poor in the Philippines so often cost more than being rich? Think about the last time you needed something small but urgent. A single stick of instant coffee, a tingy pack of detergent, a single cigarette, sold one at a time instead of by the pack. Each purchase taken alone feels manageable, but add them up over a month and you've often paid more per unit than someone who bought in bulk with cash up front. You're not bad at math. You're making the only decision available to someone who genuinely doesn't have the extra 100 pesos to spend now, even if spending it now would save money later. Walk through an entire week of tingy purchases in your head. A sachet of coffee here, a sachet of shampoo there, a small bag of cooking oil instead of a full bottle, a single egg instead of a tray. Each transaction feels small and forgettable in the moment, but multiply the markup on each one by every week of every month of every year, and the total gap between what you paid and what a bulk buyer paid for the same goods stretches into real money. Money that could have covered a month of tuition or an emergency if it hadn't quietly leaked away one sachet at a time. This isn't unique to sari stores, and it isn't unique to the Philippines either, though the pattern shows up here with unusual clarity. Back in 1963, the sociologist David Caplovitz published a landmark study called The Poor Pay More, based on interviews with low-income families in New York City. What he found upended a common assumption. People assumed poor families spent carelessly. Caplovitz discovered something almost the opposite. Poor families were often careful, deliberate shoppers, but they were trapped inside a market structure that quietly charged them more for the exact same goods and services that wealthier families accessed at lower cost. Have you ever noticed that stores in poorer neighborhoods often charge more for basic goods than stores in wealthier ones, not less? It seems backwards. Shouldn't prices be lower where people have less money to spend? But Caplovitz found the opposite pattern, and the reasons were structural, not personal. Larger supermarkets with lower prices rarely operate profitably in low-income areas, because thin margins depend on high volume, and high volume depends on customers with steady disposable income. What remains are smaller stores, charging more per item just to stay open, serving the very people who can least afford the markup. Now bring that same structure into a Philippine context, and you start to see it everywhere once you know what to look for. A jeepney driver who can't afford a lump sum motorcycle payment ends up renting daily, paying far more over a year than a straightforward loan would have cost, simply because no bank will extend credit without collateral he doesn't have. A market vendor without a warehouse buys stock every few days in small batches at a higher wholesale price each time, because buying a month's worth upfront would require capital sitting idle, capital she cannot spare even briefly. Even something as ordinary as paying bills follows the same pattern. A household without a stable bank balance pays load, water, and electricity in small increments through neighborhood outlets that charge a convenience fee for every transaction instead of a single automatic deduction that a bank account would allow for free. A family without a refrigerator buys meat and fish fresh every single day, at whatever the day's market price happens to be, instead of buying a week's supply on the one-day prices dip low and freezing the rest. Each of these habits looks like a personal preference from the outside. From the inside, every one of them is a workaround for something the household simply doesn't have: capital, storage, or a bank account that behaves like the ones wealthier households take for granted. This is where the economists Banerjee and Esther Duflo, who eventually won a Nobel Prize for their work on global poverty, made an observation that reframes the entire picture. In their research, later published as Poor Economics, they found that poor households across the world consistently pay a kind of invisible tax simply for being poor, not because of ignorance or poor choices, but because poverty removes access to the economies of scale that wealthier households take completely for granted. Buying rice in a 25-kilo sack costs meaningfully less per kilo than buying it in small daily portions. But the 25-kilo sack requires having the full amount in cash today, storage space to keep it dry and safe, and enough certainty about tomorrow to justify tying up that much money at once. Remove any one of those three conditions, and the cheaper option quietly becomes unavailable, even though it was sitting on the same shelf the whole time. Certainty is the piece that hits hardest, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. If your income arrives unpredictably, a good week at the market, a slow week when the rain keeps customers away, spending a large sum today on tomorrow's savings feels genuinely risky, not irrational. What if an emergency shows up before the bulk rice runs out? What if a child gets sick and that locked-up capital was needed for a doctor instead? The poor aren't failing to plan for the future. They're planning around a level of unpredictability that wealthier households rarely have to factor in at all. Then there's credit, and this is where the poverty premium becomes almost impossible to escape without outside intervention. Formal banks require documentation, collateral, and a credit history that many low-income Filipinos simply never had the chance to build. Without access to a bank loan at reasonable interest, informal lenders step into the gap, offering fast cash with minimal paperwork. The catch is the interest rate. 5-6 lending, so named because you borrow 500 and repay 600, commonly charges an effective interest rate that, annualized, would be illegal for any registered bank to offer. And yet, people take these loans anyway, again and again, not from ignorance, but because the alternative, no cash at all during an emergency, is worse. The economist Muhammad Yunus spent decades studying exactly this gap, eventually founding Grameen Bank on a radical premise that poor borrowers were actually more reliable than banks assumed, and that the real barrier wasn't creditworthiness. It was the absence of any lending system designed around how poverty actually works. Traditional banks wanted collateral the poor didn't have. Informal lenders offered access, but at a price that could trap a borrower in debt for years over what started as a genuinely small loan. Yunus's microfinance model tried to build a third option: small loans, manageable terms, designed for people the formal system had simply never been built to serve. It worked well enough to reshape development economics worldwide, and it proved something important along the way. The problem was never that poor people couldn't be trusted with money. The problem was that no system existed that was actually built for them. The repayment data Yunus collected over the years told a story that surprised almost everyone in traditional banking. Borrowers with no collateral, no credit history, and no formal employment repaid their small loans at rates that rivaled or beat wealthy, fully documented borrowers at conventional banks. It wasn't that poor borrowers were secretly less risky than assumed. It was that the assumption itself, that poverty signals unreliability, had never been tested rigorously before Yunus tested it. The 5-6 lenders operating on Philippine street corners today are, in a strange way, proof of the exact same demand Yunus identified decades earlier, just without the fairer terms his model tried to offer. Layer transportation on top of all this, and the poverty premium compounds further. A worker without capital for a motorcycle spends hours commuting by jeepney and tricycle, paying small fares that add up to more over a month than a motorcycle loan payment would have cost, while also losing hours of paid work time to the commute itself. Time in this equation isn't free. Every hour spent traveling is an hour not earning, and for someone paid daily or by the piece, that lost hour has a real immediate cost that a salaried office worker rarely has to think about. Even healthcare follows the same shape. A family without emergency savings delays a doctor's visit until the condition worsens, turning what could have been a cheap, early treatment into an expensive, urgent one. It's not that they don't value health. It's that the money for early treatment was never sitting there to begin with, and borrowing for it means borrowing at the same punishing informal rates that trap so many other decisions in the same cycle. Step back and look at the full shape of it. Smaller purchases at higher unit prices, informal credit at rates no formal institution could legally charge, transportation costs that eat both money and paid time, healthcare delayed until it becomes more expensive to treat. None of these are separate problems. They're the same problem, wearing different clothes, all stemming from one structural reality: Poverty removes access to scale, to credit, to certainty, and every one of those removals carries a price tag that the people who can least afford it end up paying anyway. This is why the idea that poverty comes from laziness or poor decision-making falls apart the moment you actually study it closely. Caplovitz found careful shoppers. Banerjee and Duflo found rational households navigating impossible trade-offs. Yunus found borrowers who repaid loans at rates that shamed the assumptions traditional banks had made about them for decades. The pattern isn't a story about individual failure. It's a story about a system where every path towards stability requires a small amount of stability just to access it in the first place. A genuine catch-22 built quietly into the cost of everyday life. And once you see it this clearly, something shifts in how you look at your own tingy purchases, your own 5-6 loan, your own decision to rent a motorcycle instead of buying one outright. None of that was a failure of discipline. It was the rational response of someone navigating a market that charges an invisible surcharge for not already having money, a surcharge most people never see because they've never had to pay it. You walk into a sari store and buy a single sachet of shampoo for 7 pesos. It isn't a bad decision. It's the only decision the system left available to you today. And understanding that difference between a personal failure and a structural one might be the most important shift a person can make, not because it changes the price on the shelf, but because it finally points the question in the right direction.